kind of go two ways. You can kind of go tools, process, people, or you can go people, process, tools. And that's why we always say here, like the most important part is asking the question about what the end user's problem is. So then you can actually start building from there. Because if you don't have end user buy-in, the adoption of any digital tool or transformation strategy is so much slower.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. If you are exploring the ISO journey, your current collaboration tools might outgrow your needs driven by ISO compliance. Your current legacy PLM tools may not support collaboration features. If your current processes are manual or done on a spreadsheet, you may be overwhelmed with the tracking and information required to submit to regulatory bodies. Like any other cross-functional process in your organization, your design review process requires multiple teams, including quality, engineering, and production. In today's episode, we have our guest, Adam Keating, who discusses the needs of design revision processes in the engineering departments of manufacturing companies. He also describes the deficiencies of legacy PLM systems and the amount of custom development companies need to do on top of PLM systems to make it work. Finally, he discusses the user experience issues and adoption issues in the quality department that derail quality efforts. Let me introduce Adam to you. Adam Keating is a mechanical engineer who co-founded Colab out of sheer frustration when he saw how inadequate collaboration tools were holding engineering teams back. He led development on one of the world's first Hyperloop vehicles with an international second place finish at SpaceX's 2017 competition. Invented a shaftless electric engine for aircrafts, has helped industry leaders shorten design review cycles by more than 51%, and was recently awarded Innovator of the Year by Atlantic Business Magazine, along with his co-founder, Jeremy Andrews. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Adam, welcome to the show.
Hey Sam, thank you for having me.
Of course, my pleasure. Just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus item?
Absolutely. Give you a little background. I'm a mechanical engineer from as far east as you can possibly go in Canada. Background came from working in initially energy, moved into them building one of the first biology-guided radiotherapy systems in the Bay Area, and eventually went into some aerospace applications in electric aviation. But kind of what ties it all together for me and kind of got me where I am today with Colab was an experience in building Hyperloop vehicles, actually in a SpaceX competition. And then throughout each of those four experiences, I range from student team all the way through to Fortune 100 company. Really found that the tools that engineering teams had just weren't sufficient for day-to-day collaboration and how they did actual design review. And that's sort of the genesis of what I'm focused on today. So at Colab, we give teams the fastest and easiest way to share and review CAD with anyone. And our focus is to help teams ultimately catch mistakes way earlier in the process and ultimately shorten those review cycles so that they can focus on innovation and not pushing paperwork around.
Yeah, and I really like your background, and the reason for that is because you have worked on some of the most complex manufacturing situations where you are going to have very sophisticated quality and compliance processes. Two of those are always going to be medical and aerospace, and when we look at the quality processes and the design review, obviously it's going to be extremely significant there. And as you mentioned, the catching the mistakes earlier is going to be far less expensive overall from the process perspective. If you get down to the manufacturing situation without catching those mistakes, it could be really expensive. So we are going to dig into all of that. But before we do that, we have one of these standard questions that we ask every single guest. And that is going to be, Adam, your perspective on business growth.
Yeah, it's an interesting timing for that question for us as a company too, because we're still a fairly early stage startup, and everything is about growth nowadays for us. But the way I sort of look at growth is sort of building blocks, step by step. What is the smallest piece of incremental change in a positive direction that can be made that builds towards where we're headed. So as a company today for Colab, we're obviously very small and nimble, but I think that applies very well to large companies too. And what we try to help customers do when they think about growth is, where do you want to be? What is the outcome you're looking for? And then what are some initial steps and wins we can take to get you on that path? And it's taken time with us as a company to like really see that happening, but we do this like quarterly planning framework focused around what we call a thematic goal, and the whole purpose of it is to basically set, in the next 3 to 6 months, what is the singular most important focus for the company? And if we do that, then we know we're on track for our 3 and 10 year goals. And this quarter has been quite an exciting one for us because we've hit some of our milestones, but it's the same thing when it comes to manufacturing. I think when you're building a product, it's not like software where it's as easy to be as agile. There's always going to be a longer schedule. There's always going to be complexities around actually physically building something, but breaking that down into, I would say, manageable blocks and seeing how fast and well you can go through those. That's how I think about growth, and it being sort of I saw someone post it before saying it's continuous improvement instead of it just being continuous improvement when the opportunity is there. And for us, it's all about how do we make those steps a little bit easier, so we actually can see the results a little sooner.
Yeah, completely agree with your assessment there, especially your bit about the smallest piece of incremental change, irrespective of whether you are talking about the small or large organization. As you mentioned, those small changes really add to your continuous improvement on a daily basis. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. Now we are going to move into one of these stories. I don't know if you're going to have any specific stories that you might be able to share just related to the design process, the quality process, especially when we talk about the aerospace and medical device industry. And I am actually going to bring back one of the conversations that I was having yesterday with one of the sharpest and one of the most influential machinists in the community. And typically, machinists are the way manufacturing community is going to see them, is they belong to more of the shop floor. They are not really involved in the strategic decision making. They are not necessarily part of the engineering team just because they are simply taking the instructions. And sometimes we sort of feel that, the machinists are not going to care, let's say, for the digitization or the digital transformation or the collaboration aspect. But when I was talking to her, and she was so mad overall, and she was talking about that, she has worked in the medical device and aerospace situation, and in that she had to fill so much paperwork all the time. That was sort of annoying because that is not the good use of the machinist hours.
No.
It's not good for the customer, it's not good for the company, and it's also not good for her because it is not best use of her time. And this is the first time I spoke to a machinist where I got this insight. So now, from your perspective, obviously you are talking to a lot of different engineers, people on the shop floor. For everybody, digital trail matters, especially when you talk about the quality and compliance environments. So what is your experience overall, or the story that you might be able to share from the digital trail perspective in managing the quality review process, in managing the ISO compliance?
Yeah, and Sam, I think you hit the nail on the head there. One of the things we always say here is that our goal is to help teams focus on what we say innovation and not administration. Because I go back to just some of the earlier work I would have done. I was 19 years old, intern, had really no major experience. I was just keen and hungry. Worked on a very large, complex project, a number of key tier one suppliers, and I think at the point that I joined the team, it hadn't even gone into testing. Like we were still in the early manufacturing phases for a bigger infrastructure program, and we were on change order number 250. At that point, and I think in the span of the 4 months I was there, I put through 8 or 10, each of them ranging from $10,000 on the low end up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I was just an intern, and that was my first taste of seeing what the impact of not having good communication and
Yeah.
design review and coordination up front was. Because like you said earlier in the conversation, the further you get down the design timeline, it's
Yeah.
exponentially increasing in cost. And it's more than just cost, it's actually risk from both a quality perspective, safety perspective, and everything else comes delivering to your customer. And that was sort of my first taste, but I went on and worked at a bunch of other places in different industries, and they range from massive companies to startups of 50 people. And it
Yeah.
didn't matter where I went, I always ended up building some kind of tracking tool to look at progress and
Yeah.
changes and risk registers. And it always came back to building some manual tool, mostly Excel based, and then manually keeping track of all this stuff. And sort of the tipping point for myself and my co-founder Jeremy. Jeremy worked at Tesla most recently. Tesla is obviously moving at kind of breakneck speeds in comparison to a lot of the manufacturing world.
Yeah.
But even there, the actual tools that they had access to do design review and communicate with their internal teams and then out to suppliers are no different than anybody else. Whether it's students who have all the technology in the world to manufacturers who are Fortune 100 and have all the money in the world, it's all the same. Everyone is creating design review packages in PowerPoints and Word docs and sending them out in PDFs via email and sitting down and then sending red lines back either by paper or maybe by a digital tool like Adobe. And this
Yeah.
whole process is managed by someone. And that's sort of what sparked us to say, looking at the problem we're talking about, which is, problems slipping through the cracks, quality not being there, missing timelines. Where does that start? And it comes back to communication. And we look at sort of I would say our neighbors in the software development world, back when we were mechanical engineers in industry, and they didn't have the same problem. Their problem was actually, how do we automate? How do we make this faster? Not
Yeah.
how do we talk to each other and catch these things in the first place. That wasn't the problem. And it's because they're 20 years ahead really when it comes to the tools and ecosystem. And you mentioned about PLM. PLM has improved things a lot when it comes to quality control and the system of record. But there is still a long ways for us to go in terms of how those teams work day to day. Because the truth is, right now, engineering teams, no matter how sophisticated their PLM setup, they're always going outside of it. And if you ask any of your engineers, for folks listening, where they store issues, how they do design reviews, the answer most likely, on the most common side is a spreadsheet or a list. Best case might be something like Jira, but it's almost never connected back to the actual context. And that, I think, is the opportunity in industry.
Okay, so let's talk about the deficiency of the PLM that you mentioned. And I want to make sure that number one, we are understanding what these deficiencies are. So I don't know if you're going to have any other stories that you might be able to share when they were doing, let's say, the quality reviews on PLM. What were the challenges that they were running into? Why can they not do these reviews inside PLM?
Yeah, so the truth is, when it comes to the PLM is going to be good for storing things. That
Yeah.
is really, when you look at the genesis of why PLM came about, it was meant to be a record system and a process control system, and it does those things well.
Yeah.
The part that it doesn't do well is spawn, I would say, creativity and conversation. Like those are the two things fundamentally that are missing. And if you look at, you mentioned ISO earlier, some of the key elements of like the 9001 program is actually engagement. It's how teams actually work, so they're bought into these processes, and those parts are not thought about in a PLM. And today they're starting to talk more and more about collaboration. But I
Yeah.
always give people sort of the example of, you look at SAP. SAP is a very, very complicated system, very
Yeah.
important to most companies. But if you added a chat window to SAP and said that was collaboration, that obviously wouldn't compare to what teams use in manufacturing for Microsoft Teams or Slack. It's a very,
Yeah.
very different use case. And it's just a whole different way of working. And that's what's missing. Like the fundamental thing is missing is engineering teams do not collaborate in here day to day to come up with ideas and design. They go in there to find a file, get some information, pull it out, but they're almost always bringing that back into a CAD tool, screenshotting into a PowerPoint deck, sending it around in Teams messages. And the second that starts, you lose half of what I would call digital thread. You see the industry talking a lot about it. I think the PLM does a good job of it from the record keeping side of the file. But if you look at the other half, I consider that the knowledge. is how does someone come up with this idea? How do we actually really improve based on what's happened previously? And looking at PLM as it is today, that stuff is not captured unless someone is thoughtfully capturing it, which is an administrative task at that point. And sort of our thought process is if you give teams better engagement tools, a system of engagement where everything is being captured just by the way they work, and you can tie that back into the actual data that's being created, that there's not only going to be a faster way to do it and higher quality, but you're actually going to be able to start to get insights as to how to not just make your product better, how to make your engineering team better. And that's where I think the opportunity is, because you look at ISO in particular, PLM does a good job of keeping records. People will put other tools in place for signatures and that kind of stuff. But a key part of that is how do we improve? And I think a core tenet is, putting ISO in place will improve catching mistakes, but it's a lot of process. So you want to also ensure that it's not going to slow your team down. And I think having a good system engagement can do that.
Okay, so I want to make sure that I am understanding the overall pitch about the PLM system. So let's say if we look at some of the legacy PLM systems, obviously they were not designed for the modern day collaboration. They were extremely legacy. They were also not as modern from the technology stack perspective that they could support the collaboration in addition to record keeping. As well as if you look at some of the legacy systems, I mean, they are very sophisticated and large in terms of their size overall.
Yeah.
But when you look at some of these cloud native systems in the PLM space as well, there is a lot of innovation happening. And in last 10-15 years, if you look at the PLM market, there are cloud native systems. They were sort of born in the cloud, and they had the collaboration aspect built as part of their technology stack. So I don't know if you feel that the collaboration that is built in these cloud native systems is also going to be deficient for the quality review and compliance perspective, as well as from the ISO perspective. So the comment that you are trying to make, are these more from the legacy PLM systems, or are they still applicable for the cloud native systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it depends on what part of the market you're looking at. So if you look at sort of large manufacturers, all large manufacturing companies have had PLM for really the last decade or more. Those companies don't have an off-the-shelf piece of software that they can switch out. Those are basically like custom instances that have full teams internal that have been building on top of it for years. Like if you look at an OEM in automotive, some of the ones we've talked to have teams of 50 plus developers who have been custom building for 20 years on top of Team Center. Those pieces of tools are basically like a backbone for the company now. And that kind of is like one side of the extreme. So like those are very hard to rip out. And that's sort of our position on, giving the layer of collaboration directly to PLM, or the Team Centers and the Windchill and some of the Dassault offerings, are the ones that are a little more legacy. When you look at some of the new schools things that are coming out in terms of cloud PLM, I think there is an opportunity there for those to actually do a better job of collaboration up front, because they're just built differently. They're built with a different user interface. They're built with a different model. They're built to be cloud first so that anyone can access it. The one thing that's still difficult about cloud PLM even is still the complexity. There's some that are doing, I would say they're getting closer and closer to it being something that is like bare bones. I always give the example of DocuSign. Look at DocuSign example, right? I get a DocuSign from you. I don't have DocuSign as an account. I don't even need to know what DocuSign is. I click the button, it opens up, it says, hey, Sam sent you this, click this button to sign it. Great, I do that and I'm out. That's the level of simplicity that a tool needs to have mass adoption for collaboration and design review, to have all stakeholders engaged throughout the entire supply chain. And you started the conversation with the machinist that's on the shop floor. There's no machinist on the shop floor who's going to want to, pick through PLM to try and find what is right. And that's where I think the difference is, being pointed and thoughtful about exactly what you're giving to the other person in terms of context is the single most important factor, because that's reducing the barrier to them actually engaging with you. And the barrier is super important, because you look at manufacturing, these people are slammed. They're so busy. They're getting data thrown at them everywhere. They're getting new tools from all different customers, and they need something that just opens up, they can respond to and get out. And that's always the model. So I do think there's opportunity. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see even the legacy providers move more in the cloud. But it's all about, are they going to be pointed enough around the communication element and make it easy enough for it to actually be a natively adopted thing first, or our team's going to go back to trying to find things like Microsoft Teams, things that are truly collaboration first.
So let's take an example of a manufacturer that does not understand what is the quality review process, or they might not have quality review process in place, or they might not have it documented, right? So what is the importance of the quality review process? Describe each of these steps that are going to be involved, which are going to be the actors that are going to be involved in the quality review process, and how that is relevant from the ISO perspective.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of like a couple of buckets first. So there's two core types of design review, in my opinion. One is informal, and the other is formal. The informal ones are often geared towards getting feedback, ideation, making your product an innovative thing. The formal ones are often things like PDR, CDR, so like preliminary and critical design reviews, or TRR, like a test readiness review. Those are things that are often put in place as part of an ISO process to make sure that the checks and balances are happening throughout the process. And then throughout each of those, there's really two types of review that would happen. And I think they kind of fall into the bucket of, technical versus project or program related. Technical is often like subject matter expertise in making sure that the technical side of the engineering is sound. Project program is much more of a cross-disciplinary group that is looking for a whole bunch of different perspectives. Is this going to work for the client? Do we have the budget to do this? Can we actually manufacture this thing? And when you look at the overall process, you can kind of boil down the unit of each of those things to being the same thing, the exact same thing. So what we tell customers is, regardless of whatever type of design review you are trying to do, you're going to build that into your process and your standards, all part of your ISO program or quality program. The core fundamental unit is, can I get the material and information that I need to present to other people in a package that is rich and easy for them to digest? And what you see today a lot of times is people just take, you look at an aerospace project, you're spending tens of millions of dollars in design on modeling this thing, and then the presentation that does the final review to actually go to manufacturing is a PowerPoint deck of screenshots, and you're making hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars decisions based on pictures, when you actually have a full model that you can engage with that has all the metadata you'd ever need to make these decisions. So the first step is, can you get this in a rich format that actually gives people the context without it being overwhelming? Because once you do that, you're actually able to share out that to the team. So you've created the context package. You share that out to the stakeholders, ideally early, ideally well ahead of any meeting or even in place of a meeting, in a way that they can actually go in, digest what you share with them, provide feedback sort of on their own timeline, and then actually work with you. And then the outcome of that is you get this feedback in a place that might be traditionally meeting minutes. It might be in the form of an email, could be in the form of the punch list. You take all those things, and the person who created the review, a responsible engineer, is going back through and has to actually dispose and take disposition to kind of all those pieces of feedback to say, okay, what's relevant, what's not, what changes are we going to make, how is this going to impact the timeline, cost, all the rest, and then they iterate and do this all over again. So it really breaks down into what we consider to be creating, sharing, reviewing, and then actually taking action until it gets to the point of a major milestone or gate. And what we see is sort of like the key deficiency there is, in the creation phase, you're often taking what is very rich data and turning it into something that is really just a slice in time that's hard to get the rest from. Sharing is often a very manual effort. Reviewing is often only happens in a meeting or in some kind of disconnected format, like taking a PDF offline. And then the actual action management is almost always on a project manager. And our fundamental belief is that if you just focus on that cycle, like that motion, it doesn't matter if you're doing an informal review or a formal one. It doesn't matter if you're doing a technical one or a project one. You're going to get good at that motion and getting feedback and communicating. And the better you get at that, you're just then taking different requirements and looking at how does this context apply to these set of requirements and what needs to change. And it's a much more simple process, and it becomes much more just repetitive motion. But today there's a lot of gymnastics that goes on for the engineers and the managers to actually just manage this process, which often takes precedence over the actual conversations themselves.
Yeah, so some interesting insight there, and I am going to tell you some more stories from my experience, either based on the interviews that we have done recently or based on my prior experiences. So, one of the challenges, I completely get the idea about digitizing the review process, but one of the challenges that we come across, especially from my personal experience, as well as that is validated by, I don't know if you're connected with a person called Jennifer Hernd. She used to work for
Yep.
NASA, and we
Yep.
did interview with her. And one of the things in that interview that was highlighted is when you are doing, let's say, the first article inspection, when you are doing that process, let's say you have all of your data inside your either you in the form of your 3D models or in the form of your CAD design. Now, if
Mhm.
you want your quality engineer to go in the system, then you need to reskill them. And that is where the major challenge is. I mean, it's not necessarily the system problem itself, but it's the barrier that you are going to get from the team that, what, I have been doing the design review on a piece of paper and I'm doing these ballooning
Yeah.
on a piece of paper. So why am I, learning these skills again? And what am I going to get if I do that? Why am I working hard here to make sure that? So I understand the pitch overall from the organization perspective, but there's going to be a little bit of resistance overall from the employee perspective when you are trying to bring these changes. They are, number one, not going to be comfortable with it. Number two, they might not even accept it. And because of that, even though the technology may be capable, but it's always the implementation and adoption of the technology on the shop floor that
Mhm.
matters. So in your experience, when you are working with these clients, have you seen similar resistance from the team? If you have, then what you have done to make sure that they are understanding the importance of the technology. So I don't know if you're going to have any specific stories that you might be able to share of the specific steps that you have taken to win my quality manager on the shop floor.
Yeah, no, it's funny enough. I actually have had this exact conversation with Jennifer myself, and it comes back to what I said in the very beginning that the big vision is not what's going to win over the people on the
Yeah.
shop floor, the people on the ground. That to be frank, most people that are doing their job are so consumed by that they don't have time to think about that. They're thinking about how do I get my job done the right way to make whatever milestone is they're trying to hit, and that's just like a fact of how things work, but it comes back to, what process are we taking? Are we giving them a tool and just saying use a tool for the sake of it, or are we trying to make their job easier? And that's where we kind of flip the script. Is instead of telling them, hey, you need to learn a new tool, the part that I shared a moment ago about maybe cloud PLM still not being the right option is that that's not purpose built for that end user. It's meant for PLM type things and not for someone on the shop floor to pick up a complex model and actually interpret potentially even like a model-based definition version, no drawing, just all the PMI embedded in an easy way, right? What I would suggest, and what we've actually done as an example, is say you have a complex 3D model. You want someone who's non-technical to actually go in and review that thing. You can't just send them the model and say, hey, go for it. So like
Yeah.
one of the tools we've built as an example is what we call packages. And it has a viewer built into it, but the engineer who's familiar with that model can go in and actually create predefined views and almost a walkthrough off the model with their annotations directly on the model. And the person on the other end just literally gets a web link and it opens up on their screen and there's a next and back button, just like PowerPoint would be. So it's nice and familiar. And they just click through the links and it navigates them through the model. So if they don't want to dive in, if they don't want to consume it, they just want to see it like they're used to, like a PowerPoint, perfect. If they want to dive in and click on that thing and get the context or pull up the bomb or whatever it might be, then it's there. The value proposition for the other side is that once the only button they have to get used to clicking is clicking to add feedback there. And once that first engagement happens, we always see the conversation change. So to give you a direct example, we were working with a group in the defense industry, and when COVID started, they had called us and said, we need to roll out Colab to our team tomorrow morning. And this was like 5:30 in the evening, and we had no time to really prepare any sort of training. And the very first day, their most senior quality person who had been checking drawings for 20, 30 years, either on paper in Adobe, said, I'm not using this tool. I've been doing this for 20, 30 years. I do not need it. So anyways, we took that as it was. I actually had sent the guy an email and said, hey, can we chat about this in a couple of days once you had a chance? And he told us that he actually hated the tool on the first day. So I called him 3 or 4 days later, and he picked up the phone and said, I actually love this tool now.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, how did that switch so much in 3 or 4 days? And the difference was it was built for him. Like it was built for his use case and not a tool that was like corporately driven down to say, hey, take this very complicated thing and do it. For him, what he loved was the fact that he could go find any of the drawings he'd marked up previously and not have to look through a massive stack of paper on his desk or a folder on his computer. They were all organized, all the revisions were there, all the conversations were there, and he had saved himself all that time, and he didn't care anymore that he had to do it on a screen. He cared about the fact that his job was way easier, and that's like you talk about continuous improvement. You can kind of go two ways. You can kind of go tools, process, people, or you can go people, process, tools, and that's why we always say here, like the most important part is asking the question about what the end user's problem is. So then you can actually start building from there. Because if you don't have end user buy-in, the adoption of any digital tool or transformation strategy is so much slower. So for us, we tried to get in, I would say, to the trenches with the folks that actually have to use these tools day to day. Because the more that they want to use them, because it's making their job easier, the better it's going to be for the overall, whether it's ISO program or company initiative, whatever it may be. But it's all about taking the barrier down and making it just easy. And that's why I think a lot of the traditional tools have a bit of a harder time because the barrier just in the user interface alone is very complex. So yeah, it's all about taking that first step with them. There's going to be lots of resistance, but I think if you can empathize with those folks and give them a taste of a victory for whatever their core needs are, they're a lot more accepting to trying something else.
Okay, exciting story there. Do you have any other stories that you might be able to share where obviously the user experience is always key? And if you have a tool that is going to be aligned towards the users, obviously that is going to be exciting for them. But there are always going to be bigger factors, such as it's not just one persona that you need to care for in your organization. It's going to be multiple personas, even with respect to collaboration, which is and design collaboration, which is a very small piece overall, if you really think about it, because you are talking about a very small process inside your engineering department. And your key stakeholders that you are going to have is probably going to be just your engineers, maybe machinists, I don't know, maybe quality managers that are going to be involved in the review process, maybe some of the regulations and compliance people, maybe your customers and supplier, but still you are very siloed inside your organization. So obviously you need to worry about the other things, such as how this is going to be integrated in the overall processes of the organization. So while you can make it easy for the user, but at the end of the day, if you look from the owner's perspective or the executive's perspective, they need to run the company, right? So do you have any other stories where you could sort of fit this in the entire enterprise architecture? What was the scope of the tool? How it interacted with the existing systems? I don't know if you are sitting on top of the existing PLM system. So can you describe the entire enterprise architecture in one of the engagements or these stories?
Yeah, so there's kind of different strategies. I would say, like, small companies oftentimes wouldn't have a PLM. So I'll focus more on sort of large enterprise here, the ones that have PLM and complex processes kind of in this breakdown. But you look at a company, they'll have CAD tools, they'll have PLM, they'll have an ERP, they'll have a whole bunch of other systems, and there's a whole bunch of process documentation around all of those things. The very first thing that we try to understand is, what data needs to go from where to where and what is the authoritative source of truth. Like, we fundamentally as a company don't believe in single source of truth. There's no such thing. Really, when you look at it, there's no company in the world that has everything in one system. So it's always an authoritative source of truth. And I think for us, the way we see the industry shifting is more of a connected ecosystem, much more like the software development world. Whereas today, everyone is trying to put everything inside of PLM, which then forces people outside of them to do more day-to-day work. So first thing we look at is what tools are actually critical and what is their purpose. And oftentimes for us, based on what we currently do today, PLM and CAD are sort of the two main actors we need to think about. So for the main packages, sort of the manufacturing sector, we've either built or are building direct integrations for those tools so that somebody managing a product in PLM could see that a file was in review in Colab, for example, or an engineer who's, just checked in a file could have that automatically propagate and start in the review process, and also flick that switch on in PLM and say, hey, this thing is being reviewed. But that's all about just, fitting into their process and mapping. To give you kind of the second part of your question, which was, how does this go broader, or how do you get broader adoption outside of just the engineering group? Can I give you the example of one of our Fortune 500 customers? They started using Colab as an augmentation to their PLM to accelerate change review processes. They wanted to make it easier to basically have engineers and manufacturing folks across multiple countries review change packages in context of 3D, in the context of 3D and the 2D package, and get their feedback addressed quicker. That was how it started. So it started a small group that grew to an entire division, jumped into another division, and then it started getting some attention to say, hey, where else could we benefit from this type of collaboration? And this was also during COVID. At the time, this company was doing in-person VAV events and really focusing on how to improve their products, drive down costs and look at the next generation. And they couldn't travel anymore. So first they came to us and said, could you do this virtually, thinking like video recorded? And then we proposed back and said, what if we did it virtually, but in 3D? And that fundamentally changed how that company behaved around one of their core processes for improvement. So rather than actually traveling to 5-10 people, traveling to a manufacturing plant, spending tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so, they were taking all of their existing design data, putting it into a very simple package that could be shared to everyone in the team around the world. They then could all work on the same package in real time, adding feedback and ideas and communicating. And then if they weren't online because they were 12 hours apart, when they came in the next morning, it was all there and nobody had to curate it. At the end of the day, that particular outcome, the very first event, took each engineer on the order of a couple of hours. Previously, it was about a week commitment for the engineers involved. They had almost 3 times the number of people engaged in the process. And they actually found 2 times, a little more than 2 times the number of ideas for how to make their product better for the next year. What actually came out of the outside of that is then every single month for the remainder of that year, and even going to this day, they've set up one of these events in collab. And it's just, a lot of them are not directly in the core engineering team. It's managers, it's folks sort of at their product vision level, it's people in supply chain. It's much, much broader than that. And that just became the truth because people saw how easy it was to communicate and be creative. And that's really where I think the opportunity here is, get people back to creating and engineering and solving problems and take away sort of the administrative burden. And you can do that in a smart way where your quality actually goes up as well. Because in this case, the quality of that product is also going to improve because they found a number of opportunities. Cost is going to go down, and they spent a lot less time figuring it out just because they had a tool to help them do it. So, it comes back to whatever, like I said before, like what the end user problem is, and not what the software is in the beginning. Because in that case, collab might not have been the right solution. And we're not afraid to tell a company that, we're not the right tool for them. Great example of that is, some small startups with a couple of people who come to us and want to focus on collaboration. We tell them, like, do you have a CAD tool? And if they say no, well then, looking at something like Onshape first actually probably makes sense because Onshape is going to do what they need. If you're a big company that has big legacy tools and you're looking for that, it's going to be a hard switch. And that's where we actually make the differentiation. So it's all about understanding what the user needs, the processes that you're hoping to achieve, and then seeing what tools fit rather than the other way around.
Okay, amazing. That's it for today. Do you have any last minute closing thoughts, Adam, by any chance?
No, I think my biggest, there was one takeaway would be, finding the smallest nugget of getting people engaged in more, collaborative and conversational type systems. And find something that you can get a quick win on, because once that type of action starts, there's a bit of a snowball, and we've seen a massive change over the last 14 months since teams started shifting to Microsoft Teams. Like with COVID, it just like all of a sudden we saw people switch to wanting to only talk that way, sending us video links that way, and I think there's going to be a bit of a snowball effect over the next 5 to 10 years because the generation coming into the manufacturing world, they don't know a world without tools like this. And the folks that are in the manufacturing world have just gotten, a full year preview of what it could be like. So figure out what can, be the easiest first step, and don't focus so much on the home run. Focus on what is the first step that can get you towards, that end destination.
Okay, and my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be the digital trail and the collaboration is important in identifying those mistakes early that may result into the financial consequences. So the more digitally enabled you are in your cross-functional processes, the more ROI you are going to get, the more engaged users you are going to have across the entire enterprise. On that note, Adam, I would like to thank you for your time. This has been an insightful episode.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Adam, head over to collabsoftware.com. It's COLABSOFTWARE.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Jennifer Heron, who discusses how 3D CAD models can improve cross-functional collaboration and design from consumers' perspective. Also, the interview with Andrew Hood, who discusses why classifying and promoting the reuse of parts is vital to save costs. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.